Thomas Sowell is one of the greatest philosophers of our time, yet he isn't even mentioned among the 100 most influential African Americans in Ebony magazine. To help more people learn about him, please consider liking this video and subscribing. To get useful materials about Dr. Thomas Sowell, please visit the website. Thank you, and let's begin.
Well, you link wealth creation to the acquisition of skills and the employment of skills in a disciplined way, and also in a frugal way in terms of lifestyles. But others would attribute the generation of poverty, the obverse of wealth, to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, economic exploitation. How do you handle those arguments?
Well, insofar as those arguments are meant seriously, you can simply look at evidence. Insofar as they're purely political arguments, they're saying what people want to hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you think that's the problem, then there's not only a quicker solution, but there's a more emotionally and morally satisfying solution. Namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty and colonialism? The reverse, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. That when the Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter.
This is why I feel like I'm so out of my depth when I'm reacting to this sort of content, because I'm just now learning a lot of this, and I'm reviewing people who are historians, who understand a lot more than than this land we live. They know a lot more. Their information is vast, and when they're coming from, when they're hitting on their points as to why they believe certain things, they don't touch on anything local. They don't touch on anything like within their state, not even just within the country. They're pointing out other, other countries who pretty much ran their countries in certain type of ways that relate directly to what he's speaking on. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. You could tell he was a professor, man. I would have done me well to have had the opportunity to learn under someone as smart as this brother right here. But if y'all like this sort of content, please do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, also the notification bell, so that next time we post content, you'd be the first to be notified. Thank you.
Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development, because England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British. That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome. But that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through. So I'm not saying this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came. And Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland. And then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
Well, does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world, there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
No, because I think politically it's impossible. I hear from various parts of some independent nations, they say that they were better off under colonialism and so on. That isn't in the cards. The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that in the operation of the multinational corporation today. Do you see that, the operation of the multinational corporation, as help or hindrance to the generation of wealth in developing countries?
Well, in those countries, the multinational corporations very often not only pay more money than the local industry pays, but it brings in skills that don't exist and creates industries that never were there before. To that extent, I think they are a source of the transmission of international human capital. To that extent, yes.
Now, this excerpt is taken from the book, Intellectuals and Race, by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In addition to the inherent
That's a book I gotta read. That's a book I gotta read. Y'all know that I just now had one of my amazing supporters sent me the 2 hard copies of Jordan Peterson's books. And then another one of my amazing supporters sent me the audibles, the audio books through Amazon Prime of the Jordan Peterson one. So when I'm not at home and I don't have the time to really crack a book open, while I'm driving, I can listen to it. For both of you, thank you so much. But this is another one I definitely need to get to once I'm done with these books, which won't be for a while now. So I got time before I go get Intellectuals and Race, but I definitely want to see it.
The book, Intellectuals and Race, by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In addition to the inherent geographic advantages that Western Europe has had over Eastern Europe, for example, more navigable waterways leading to the open seas, with Western European rivers and harbors not being frozen over, as often or as long in winter as rivers and harbors in Eastern Europe, due to the warming effect of the Gulf Stream on Western Europe. Another major historic advantage growing out of geography is that Western Europe was more readily accessible to invasion by Roman conquerors. Despite the ruthless slaughters in those conquests and the subsequent brutal oppressions by the Roman overlords, among the lasting advantages which the Roman conquests brought to Western Europe were Roman letters, so that Western European languages had written versions centuries before the languages of Eastern Europe did. To the enormous advantages of literacy, as such, Western Europeans had the further advantage of a far greater accumulation of written knowledge in their languages, even after the languages of Eastern Europe began to develop written versions, but still had not yet caught up with the centuries-long accumulations of knowledge written in Western European languages. Literacy was not the only thing that moved from west to east in Europe. So did coins, printing presses, castles, crossbows, paved streets, and vaccinations, among other economic and social advances. But all of this took time, sometimes centuries. Moreover, people from Western Europe, Germans, Jews and others, were often a majority of the population in Eastern European cities in earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides.
Slavs, that's where they said slavery came from. Slavery started there, right? I believe somebody said that.
In earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides. For example, before 1312 the official records of the city of Krakow were kept in German, and the transition, at that point, was to Latin. Only decades later did Poles become a majority of the population in Krakow. The towns of medieval East Central Europe were often cultural enclaves of foreigners, again, mostly Germans, but with many Jews as well and, in the Balkans, Greeks and Armenians, joined in later centuries by Turks. In short, there has been for centuries, not only a disparity between the opportunities and advances in the two halves of Europe, but great disparities within Eastern Europe itself, between the indigenous peoples of the region, and the transplanted Western Europeans living in Eastern Europe, the Baltic and the Balkans. Neither genes nor discrimination are necessary to explain this situation, though some intellectuals and politicians have chosen to claim that the differences have been due to race and others have chosen to blame social injustices. Many other racial and other groups in many other parts of the world have likewise ended up with large disparities in opportunities and achievements, for reasons that range across a wide spectrum and cannot be reduced to genes or injustices. Thank you for watching this presentation to the end. Please.
Thomas Sowell, another mastermind, another great mind that a few people don't like and don't trust, who are on the other side of what he believes. But I want to hear what y'all got to say about this in the comments below. If you have yet to hit that subscribe button, please make sure you do so on your way out the door. You guys have been amazing, man. Thank y'all for everything. Love y'all. Bye.
Perpetrate, cause this 38 will be designated for all those that hate it like just man, I'm contemplating. Your moves you lose, now your hot you gave me new moves, more dudes, now the top you made me, same rules, new crews, now the